Please check that cake. The small, uncertain voice of a 3-year-old girl, the daughter of the housekeeper, suddenly rang out in the middle of the lavish birthday celebration of the son of the most powerful Mafia boss in New York. That one innocent sentence was enough to sink the entire grand hall into silence. No one could understand why a little child was staring at the birthday cake with such a serious face. And yet, when the boss, Alessandro Moretti, decided to listen to her and gave the order to check the cake, every single person in the room went completely still. Only minutes later, the scene that had been filled with laughter turned into a moment of panic unlike anything the house had ever known. Stay until the very end of this story, because what happens next will be beyond anything you could possibly imagine, and will change the fates of every single character in it forever. For a moment, no one in the grand hall moved. The little girl's voice still hung in the air like a bell that had not finished ringing. Please check that cake. 5 small words, spoken by a 3-year-old in a room full of the most powerful men and women in New York. And yet those 5 words had frozen everything. Sophia was the first to break the silence. She rushed forward, her heels catching on the polished marble, her hands shaking as she reached for her daughter. She pulled Lily back behind the fold of her apron, pressed the little girl close against her side, and began to apologize in a voice that trembled with something closer to terror than embarrassment. I am so sorry, sir. Please, forgive her. She does not understand. She is only 3. Please, I will take her out. I am so sorry, please. Her face had gone pale. Every mother in the room understood the fear in her eyes, the fear of a woman who did not know how much power the man in front of her was about to use, and against whom. But Alessandro Moretti did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hand. He did not even turn his head to look at Sophia. He was looking at the child. The cake knife was still in his hand, the long silver blade catching the light of the chandeliers above. He set it down on the white linen with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man of his stature. The soft click of metal on porcelain was the only sound in the entire hall. Then, slowly, in front of hundreds of guests who had never in their lives seen this man kneel for anything, Alessandro Moretti bent down. He lowered himself onto one knee until his eyes were level with the little girl's. His broad shoulders no longer towered above her. His face, the face that men in 5 boroughs had learned to fear, softened into something almost unrecognizable. Why do you want me to check the cake, little one? His voice was quiet. It was the kind of voice a father used at the edge of a small bed in a dark room. Not a boss. Not a king of a city that whispered his name. A father. Lily looked up at her mother, then back at him. Her small hand was still clutching the fabric of Sophia's apron. Her eyes, those enormous brown eyes, did not leave Alessandro's face. A few steps behind him, Ethan stood beside the 3-tiered white cake, 8 candles still burning on top, wax dripping slowly onto the frosting. The boy did not understand what was happening. He looked at his father, then at the strange little girl, then back at his father again. Around them, hundreds of guests in tailored suits and jeweled gowns stood in absolute stillness. Some had frozen mid-sip, glasses of champagne raised halfway to their lips. No one whispered, no one shifted their weight, no one dared even to breathe too loudly, as if the smallest sound might shatter something they could not yet see. 15 years of ruling the Moretti family had taught Alessandro many things. It had taught him how to read faces across a table. It had taught him to spot a lie before the liar had finished speaking. And it had taught him something else, something more important now than it had ever been before. It had taught him the difference between a child playing pretend and a child telling the truth. He watched Lily's small mouth, the way her tiny chin trembled once and then held steady. He watched the seriousness in her eyes, a seriousness that did not belong on the face of anyone so young. There was no game in that face. He waited. He did not rush her. He did not press. He simply reached out and rested his hand lightly on her small shoulder, and in a voice softer than anyone in that hall had ever heard from him, he said, "Go on. Tell me exactly what you heard." Lily took a small breath, the kind of breath that a very young child takes when she is trying to gather all the pieces of a memory that is still fresh in her head. Her fingers stayed curled tightly around the fabric of her mother's apron, but her eyes never left Alessandro's face. "A few minutes ago," she began, her voice thin and uncertain, "I was looking for my mommy." She paused, uncertain if she was supposed to keep going. Alessandro nodded once, gently, without a word. "I went behind the kitchen, where the long hallway is. It was quiet there. I thought maybe Mommy was cleaning." She stopped again and swallowed, her small throat moving with the effort. Her voice grew even smaller, the way a child's voice grows small when she remembers something that frightened her but that she is trying to be brave about. "There was a man. He was not looking at me. He was on the phone. He was talking quiet, but I could hear. She hesitated. Alessandro did not move. He did not blink. He simply waited, one knee still on the marble floor, his hand still resting softly on her shoulder. He said, her small forehead furrowed with concentration, as if she were carefully lifting each word out of her memory and placing it in front of him without dropping any. He said, I did exactly what you asked. The words came out slowly, then a little faster. He said, the bomb has already been placed inside the birthday cake. The last sentence dropped into the silence of the grand hall like a coin into a very deep well. Somewhere far behind Alessandro, a woman gasped and then quickly bit her hand to keep the sound from spreading. A man in a black tuxedo took a single step back from the table without realizing he was doing it. No one spoke. No one dared. Alessandro said nothing. He did not ask her to repeat it. He did not ask her what a bomb was, though he suspected she did not fully know. He did not ask her what the man looked like, or how tall he was, or what he wore. She was 3 years old. She had already given him more than any grown man in that room could have given him in an hour of questioning. She had given him the exact words. The words were too specific. The rhythm of the sentence, the pause between did exactly what you asked and the bomb has already been placed, was the rhythm of an adult reporting the completion of a task to someone waiting on the other end of a line. It was not the rhythm of a child inventing a story. A child could not invent that. A child would have said a bad man wants to hurt everyone. A child would have said there is something scary in the cake. A child would not have said, I did exactly what you asked. Cold moved through him. It started at the base of his neck and traveled slowly down his spine, and it did not stop until it reached the soles of his shoes. He rose to his feet. He rose slowly, the way a man rises when the ground beneath him has just changed shape. The gentleness that had softened his face a moment ago was gone now. What replaced it was something else entirely, the face that lieutenants and rival bosses knew, the face that had made men in this city step aside when he entered a room. Cold, focused, absolutely still. Around him, the guests and his own men remained frozen, waiting, breath held. Ethan looked up at his father with wide, uncertain eyes, still not understanding. Sophia held Lily against her, her face drained of color, her lips pressed together so tightly they had gone white. She did not dare speak. Alessandro turned his head toward the cake. The 3-tiered white creation stood at the center of the long table, its cream frosting smooth and perfect, its 8 candles still burning bright and steady, small flames flickering above the sugar. Beautiful, innocent, ordinary. If the child was right in a matter of minutes, his son and everyone in this hall would be dead. If the child was wrong, he had only interrupted a party. He chose to believe her. Something wrong, something coming. A pressure behind his ribs that he had learned, over 15 years, never to ignore. He gave the order, cut the cake, check it, now. 3 sentences, 12 words, delivered in a voice that carried across the grand hall without ever being raised. There was no explanation. There was no apology to the guests. There was no smile to soften the strangeness of what he had just said. Alessandro Moretti did not owe the people in this room an explanation, and he did not have the seconds left to give one even if he had wanted to. The hall fell silent for the second time in the span of a minute. If the first silence had been the silence of confusion, this one was the silence of dread. The silence that comes when a room full of intelligent people suddenly realizes that something they do not yet understand is very, very wrong. Guests looked at one another. Eyebrows rose. Mouths opened as if to ask a question, then closed again. A woman in a green silk gown near the front turned to her husband, whispered something with her eyes, and gripped his arm. But no one spoke. No one dared to raise a voice in this house. Alessandro Moretti was not a man that one questioned. His guards were already moving before the last word had left his mouth. They had spent years learning to obey him without needing to know why. The tone was enough. The stillness in his shoulders was enough. 4 of them stepped forward as one, forming a widening arc around the long table, their arms open, guiding the guests back with steady professional movements. Please, sir. Please, madam. Step back. This way. Voices low, firm, no panic, not yet. The guests moved without protest. Champagne glasses were set down on the nearest surfaces. Silk hems whispered against the marble floor as the crowd retreated in a slow, uncertain wave. Another guard, taller than the rest, walked briskly toward the kitchen entrance and returned within seconds, carrying a long, thin blade, not a cake knife, but something with a heavier grip, the kind of blade used for opening crates and cutting through resistance. Alessandro did not watch him approach. He was already moving. He reached behind him, took Ethan by the shoulders, and gently but firmly pulled the boy back, until his own body Ethan stumbled once against his father's leg but did not resist. He had lived long enough with this man to know when to stop asking questions. A few paces to the side, Sophia had already lifted Lily off the ground. She backed away toward the far wall, holding the little girl tightly against her chest, one hand cradling the back of Lily's head, the other pressed against her small back. Her lips were moving silently. Prayer, perhaps, or a mother's private plea to whichever God might still be listening in a room like this. The guard reached the table. He did not cut the top of the cake. He did not disturb the 8 burning candles, or the smooth curl of piped frosting along the upper edge. He knelt slightly, lowered the blade to the lowest tier, and made a clean, precise incision through the white cream at the base. The frosting parted. A wedge of soft sponge came away in his hand. For half a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then he saw it. Wires. 2 thin ones, red and green, threaded neatly into the soft interior of the cake. A small, matte black device pressed carefully into the sponge, and on top of that device, a tiny electronic display, glowing dim red in the shadow of the pastry. The numbers on the display were counting down. The guard's face went white in the space of a single breath. His hand froze in midair. When his mouth opened, no sound came out for a long half-second, and then a strangled shout cracked from his throat. "Boss timer, less than a minute!" Somewhere behind Alessandro, a woman began to cry, a soft, broken sob that started in the back of her throat. Her husband clamped a hand over her mouth almost instantly, but the sound had already escaped into the silence of the hall. It hung there for one terrible second. Alessandro did not shout. He did not slam a fist against the table. He did not curse. He did not waste even a fraction of a breath on the fear that was surely moving through him. He said only one thing, 6 words, clear as a bell in a burning building. "Everyone out, now!" The next 30 seconds moved faster than any 30 seconds any of them had ever lived. The order broke the stillness like a rifle shot. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, the grand hall of the Moretti estate transformed from a frozen photograph into a stampede of silk and terror. Guests turned as one and rushed toward the exit, their polished shoes scraping and skidding across the marble floor. Chairs tipped over and clattered against the stone. A gilded chair beside the long table went down with a splintering crack. Somewhere near the middle of the crowd, a champagne glass slipped from a woman's hand and shattered into 1,000 small stars across the floor. A woman screamed. Another screamed after her. A third pressed both hands to her mouth and did not stop running. Alessandro did not wait to see any of it. He turned to Ethan, dropped low, and lifted the boy into his arms in one clean motion. 8 years old was not small, but in that moment, his son felt as light as a folded coat. Ethan's arms locked around his neck without needing to be told. His small legs wrapped instinctively around his father's waist. There were no questions now. There was no time for questions. A few paces to his left, Sophia had already broken into a run. Lily was pressed against her chest, both her tiny arms circling her mother's neck, her face buried in the curve of her shoulder. Sophia did not look back either. Her eyes were fixed on the same door as Alessandro's, the long arched doorway at the far end of the hall, 10 meters that suddenly felt like 100. The guards funneled the guests through with the efficiency of men who had been trained for exactly this kind of moment. Move, move, do not stop. Voices barking, hands pushing, bodies flowing forward like water breaking through a dam. Alessandro was the last man out of the hall. He did not look back. He did not glance at the cake behind him, or at the terrible little red numbers still counting down in the soft white sponge. He did not think about the empire he had built in this city, or about the enemies who had spent 15 years failing to touch him. He did not think about who had done this, or how, or why. Those thoughts would come later. All of them would come later, and none of them mattered now. All he thought about, as his feet hit the marble in long strides, was the small warm body pressed against his chest, the rapid rise and fall of Ethan's breathing against the side of his neck, the way his son's little fingers had knotted themselves into the fabric of his shirt, gripping so tightly the knuckles must have been white beneath his sleeve. 60 seconds. 50. 40. He ran. He crossed the threshold of the arched doorway. He crossed the wide stone corridor beyond it. He crossed the marble steps that led down toward the front lawn. Cold night air struck his face like a slap of clean water. His shoes hit the grass. He kept running. Sophia was already ahead of him, Lily still folded against her chest. Behind them, the grand hall exhaled. It was not a sound like anything the estate had ever known. It was not the sharp crack of gunfire, not the rolling boom of a distant explosion. It was something deeper, something that came from the belly of the earth. A roar, a rupture. A great collapse of air and stone and glass all pushed outward at once, as if the entire building had drawn in one final breath and released it. The shockwave caught Alessandro from behind and lifted him off his feet. He went down hard, twisting his body in the air so that when he struck the grass, it was his shoulder that hit first, not his son. Ethan landed inside the cradle of his arms, protected. Alessandro held him there, curled around him, pressing the small body into the earth beneath his own weight. A few meters away, Sophia had also fallen. She lay on her side in the grass, one arm shielding Lily's head, her whole body wrapped around the little girl like a shell. Glass rained down around them. The heavy oak doors of the grand hall exploded outward in a hail of splinters. Black smoke rose into the night sky, thick and bitter, curling upward against the stars above the estate. Alessandro did not move. He did not check for wounds. He did not check for danger. He only held on. The roar had ended. What replaced it was a strange, ringing silence, the kind of silence that follows a great violence, when the ears refuse to accept that the world can be quiet again so soon. Somewhere in the distance, a woman was weeping. Somewhere else, a man was shouting orders in a voice that had gone raw. But those sounds felt far away, muffled, as if they were traveling through water. The lawn in front of the estate lay under a slow drifting fog of smoke and pulverized stone. Bits of glass glittered across the grass like frost. A charred piece of curtain, still faintly smoldering at one edge, had landed several meters away. A silver serving tray, warped and twisted almost beyond recognition, lay half buried in the earth. Alessandro lifted his head. The movement took effort. His shoulder ached where he had struck the ground. Ash and grit clung to the side of his face, but he raised himself onto one elbow, and with hands that shook more than he wanted to admit, he began to search his son. Ethan, look at me." The boy's eyes were open, wide, startled, but open. "Look at me. Move your hands. Move them, son." Ethan lifted both small hands. He wiggled his fingers. There was no blood. There were no tears in the small tuxedo his father had bought him for tonight. There was only dust in his hair and a smear of soot along one cheek, as if someone had brushed him gently with a piece of charcoal. Alessandro exhaled. It came out of him in one long shudder, not quite a sob, but not far from it. He pulled the boy against his chest and held him there, tightly, both arms wrapped around him, one hand cupping the back of his head. He pressed his lips into his son's hair. "You are safe. You are safe. Papa has you." Around them, the guards had already formed a wide perimeter. Weapons were drawn. Eyes scanned the tree line, the driveway, the shadows between the outbuildings. In their world, an explosion was rarely the end of an attack. It was more often the beginning. But no second wave came. No gunfire from the darkness. No engines roaring up the long drive. Only the crackle of flames behind them and the slow drift of smoke into the black sky. A few meters away, Sophia was sitting up now, her arms still locked around her daughter. Ash streaked her cheek. Her hair had come loose from its neat pin. But Lily, tucked against her chest, was blinking calmly at the world, one small hand still curled into her mother's collar. No blood, no injury, only the wide, quiet eyes of a child who had once again seen something the grown-ups around her did not yet understand. Alessandro turned at last to look behind him, where the grand hall had stood only moments ago. There was now no grand hall. The vaulted ceiling was gone. The tall arched windows that had once looked out over the gardens were gone. The heavy oak doors he had run through were gone. What remained was a jagged black skeleton of scorched walls and collapsed beams, wrapped in an orange glow that shifted and pulsed as flames climbed higher into what was left of the ceiling. A river of dark smoke rose from it and poured itself into the night above the estate. That room, that very same room. Only minutes ago, it had been full of chandeliers and violin music, full of jeweled women and their tuxedoed husbands, full of laughter, of clinking glasses, of a boy about to blow out 8 small candles. And in his hand, in that room, there had been a silver knife and a cake. If he had cut it, if he had lowered the blade even one time, his son would not be breathing against his shoulder right now. Neither would he, neither would any of them. Alessandro rose slowly to his feet. His legs were unsteady beneath him, but he made them hold. He set Ethan carefully down on the grass, kept one hand on the boy's back, and turned toward the little girl who had spoken up when no one else in the room had understood what was coming. He walked over. He knelt in the grass beside them, ignoring the ash that streaked his sleeves, ignoring the guards, ignoring the fire, ignoring everything that a man of his position should have been attending to at that moment. He placed his hand very gently on the top of Lily's small head. His voice, when it came, was low and unsteady in a way that no one who had ever done business with him would have recognized. "You saved my son's life tonight, little one. And mine." Sophia did not answer. She could not. She only bowed her head over her daughter, and the tears she had held back for the last several minutes finally broke and ran freely down her face, cutting clean paths through the ash on her cheeks. Beneath a sky of red firelight and black smoke, on a lawn covered in the wreckage of everything he had built for tonight, the most powerful man in New York knelt beside a housekeeper and her 3-year-old daughter, and in that moment, there was no distance left between them. By the time midnight passed over the Moretti estate, the fire trucks had gone. The last of the guests had been escorted away in a slow procession of black cars, their drivers instructed to speak of nothing they had seen. The wreckage of the grand hall still smoldered faintly at the far end of the property, its collapsed skeleton hidden now beneath a thick layer of foam and darkness. But the residential wing of the estate had been untouched. 200 meters of stone and marble had stood between the explosion and the private quarters. That distance, tonight, had been the difference between grief and mercy. Ethan slept in a smaller guest room on the second floor, one that had been prepared for him within an hour of the blast. A doctor had come and gone, had checked the boy for any hidden injury, had shaken his head in quiet amazement, and given him a mild sedative to help him rest through the night. 2 guards now stood outside his door. 2 more had been placed at the base of the staircase leading up to that floor. No one entered the second floor tonight without being seen. Sophia and Lily had been given a room in the east wing. Alessandro had made the decision without hesitation. They would not be leaving the estate tonight, not with what the little girl had heard behind the kitchen, not with a bomber still unaccounted for in this city. It had been offered gently, as a request, but there had been no room in it to refuse. Sophia had only nodded, holding her daughter's hand tightly in her own, and thanked him with eyes that were too tired to hide anything. Now, in the deep quiet of the small hours, Alessandro sat alone in his private study. The lamp on the desk was low. The heavy curtains had been drawn. A single glass of dark liquor stood untouched at his elbow. He had not taken off the jacket he had been wearing when the explosion happened. There was still faint dust on the shoulder where he had struck the ground. Alessandro Moretti was a name that people in this city did not speak carelessly. He was 40 years old. He had led the Moretti family through some of the fiercest years the city had seen in a generation. His name touched the docks and the casinos and the quiet, elegant restaurants of Manhattan, where politicians pretended not to know him. His shadow stretched across 5 boroughs. Rival families spoke of him in low voices. Mayors returned his calls before returning anyone else's. A single word from him could open a door or close one forever. He was a man an entire city was afraid of, and tonight, that man had come within one careless swing of a knife of losing his only son. The thought would not leave him. He kept coming back to it. Not to the fear he had felt in the moment of the running. That had already been buried, the way men like him buried such things. What he could not push away was the smaller, colder thought that had followed the fear. This had not been an outside enemy. An outside enemy could not have walked past his gate. An outside enemy could not have entered his kitchen. An outside enemy could not have crossed the length of the service corridor with a bomb in his hand and returned to the party as if nothing had happened. Whoever had done this was already inside the house. Whoever had done this was someone he paid, someone he fed, someone whose face he greeted in the morning without looking twice, someone who wore a Moretti uniform, or carried a Moretti badge, or answered to a Moretti name. Slowly, in his mind, he began to build a list. Not a written list, nothing on paper. He built it in his head, the way he had built lists for 15 years. A list of every man and every woman who had been in a position to touch that cake between the moment it entered the estate and the moment his own knife had almost fallen upon it. Who received it at the gate, who inspected it, who signed for it, who carried it, who placed it on the table. The list was not long, but every name that surfaced was a name he knew, a name he had trusted, a name he had smiled at across a table, a name whose family he had helped, whose troubles he had solved, whose loyalty he had never once questioned, or so he had believed. Tonight, in the quiet of his own study, Alessandro Moretti learned a lesson he had somehow, impossibly, managed to avoid learning across 15 years of ruling the streets of New York. In his world, the enemy at the gate was never the one who killed you. It was always the one already inside the walls, the one whose voice you had learned to trust, the one whose footsteps in the hallway you no longer even noticed. He sat very still. His hand rested on the polished surface of the desk, slowly closing into a fist. The knuckles whitened. Tomorrow morning, he would have to open a door in his own house that he had never wanted to open. Tomorrow morning, he would have to look at faces he had loved, and ask himself which one of them had smiled at his son tonight, while a bomb sat cooling inside a cake. Tomorrow morning, he would begin an investigation that no one, absolutely no one, could be allowed to know about. He raised the glass at last, but he did not drink from it. He simply held it, watching the low lamplight slide slowly along the amber. Somewhere on the floor above him, his son was breathing quietly in his sleep. For that, and only for that, Alessandro Moretti was still alive tonight. The first light of morning came in gray and cold through the tall windows of the study. Alessandro had not slept. He had not left the room. The glass of dark liquor still stood untouched at his elbow, the amber inside it slowly warming to the color of the rising sun. Sometime after 4, he had unbuttoned his cuffs and rolled up his sleeves. Sometime after 5, he had washed his face at the small basin in the corner and returned to the desk without changing his shirt. There was still faint dust on the collar. He did not care. At 6, he pressed a small button beneath the edge of the desk. Within 12 minutes, 4 men had entered the study through the private hallway that only Alessandro's most trusted lieutenants used. They were older than most of the guards on the estate. They had been with the Moretti family for years. They had seen him lose his temper only twice in a decade, and both times they had watched the men on the receiving end of that temper never be seen again. This morning, he did not raise his voice. He gestured for them to close the door. They closed it. He gestured for them to remain standing. They remained standing. Then he began. What happened in this house last night did not happen. The 4 men did not answer. They understood. There was no bomb. There was no cake. There was a gas leak in the ceiling of the grand hall. That is the story the newspapers will print by tomorrow morning. Our contacts at the 3 main papers will be spoken to before breakfast. The wire services will follow. No photograph of the interior of the hall will be published. No guest will be interviewed. If one of them is approached, our people will find that reporter first and explain that the story is not one worth writing. He did not need to say what explain meant. The men in the room already knew. No police, no fire marshal beyond the ones already paid, no federal file, no inquiry. To the outside world, this was an accident, and the Moretti family is grateful that no one was harmed. He allowed a pause to settle over the room. Then his voice dropped a full register lower. Inside this house, a different truth. He rose slowly to his feet. He walked around the desk. He stopped in front of the 4 men and looked at each of them in turn, without hurry, without warmth. I want to know who did this. He said it plainly, as if he were asking for the weather report. I want to know everything about that cake, where it was baked, which oven it came out of, which van it rode in, which driver signed the delivery, which of my men opened the gate for that van, who received the box at the service entrance, who inspected it, who carried it, who touched it. Every hand that came within a meter of that cake, between the moment it left the bakery and the moment I lifted the knife over it. I want a name attached to that hand. I want the time. I want the minute. I want the second, if you can give it to me. He walked slowly along the row of them. I want a complete record of every person who entered this estate in the 24 hours before the party. Every delivery, every visitor, every meeting, every phone call placed from this house, every phone call received, every unusual bank movement from every man and every woman on our payroll. I don't care how small the amount is. If someone in this house has bought their wife a new car this month, I want to know where the money came from. He stopped in front of the eldest of the 4 men. His voice grew softer, which somehow made it more dangerous. You will report to me and only to me, not to each other, not through any lieutenant, not through any middleman. If one of you learns something and finds himself standing next to another of you, you will not speak of it until you are alone with me in this room. Is that understood? It was not a question. 4 heads inclined once. 4 voices, very low, answered as one. Yes, boss. Alessandro returned to the chair behind the desk and sat down. Move. They moved. When the door closed behind them, he remained still for a long moment. Then he reached for the small telephone at the corner of the desk and pressed a single button. The east wing. Double the guard. No one enters. No one leaves. Meals delivered by Rico only. No one else. If the housekeeper asks a question, you answer politely and tell her she is safe. If the child asks a question, you smile and change the subject. He hung up. The child in the east wing had heard a voice she should not have heard. To the world beyond the walls of this estate, she was only the daughter of a woman who cleaned floors. To Alessandro Moretti, she was the single thin thread that had kept his son from being buried this week. He would not allow that thread to be cut. The report came back faster than Alessandro had expected. He had thought it would take days. He had prepared himself for days. He had told himself, sitting alone in the study before dawn, that whoever had done this would be a careful man, and careful men left small tracks that took a long time to find. He had been ready to wait a week if needed, 2 weeks, however long it took to find the truth without missing the smallest detail. The truth came back before the afternoon. The eldest of the 4 men returned to the study first. He came through the private hallway again, alone as instructed, and he did not sit down. He stood in the same spot where he had received his orders that morning, his hands folded in front of him, his face carefully blank. He had learned long ago that the news a boss did not want to hear was best delivered without expression. Boss. Alessandro looked up from the papers on his desk. Report. The man took a breath. He began. The cake had been ordered 3 weeks in advance from the bakery the Moretti family had used for years, the same bakery that had supplied every important occasion in this house for more than a decade. The 2 bakers who had prepared it had been in the shop from dawn until dusk on the day before the party, and both had been under observation from a distance without knowing it. Neither had been left alone with the finished cake for more than the seconds required to lift it into the box. Neither had a phone call, a bank transfer, or a visitor that raised the smallest concern. The delivery van had left the bakery in the early afternoon. 2 young men had driven it. Both had been on the Moretti family's approved list of contractors for several years. The van had made no stops between the bakery and the estate. It had arrived at the front gate at the hour it was expected. The guard at the gate had inspected the exterior of the box, spoken briefly to the drivers, and waved them through. The van had proceeded to the service entrance at the back of the estate. There, the box had been handed to 1 man. The report paused for the first time. Vincent, boss. Alessandro did not move. The man continued. Vincent had received the box at the service entrance. Vincent had personally carried it into the kitchen. Vincent had signed the delivery slip. In the cold room at the back of the kitchen, Vincent had opened the box in the presence of the head chef and had performed the final inspection of the cake himself, checking the frosting, the tiers, the candles that would be placed later. The chef had confirmed that Vincent had spent perhaps 3 minutes alone with the cake in the cold room before summoning him back for the final review. 3 minutes was a small window, but 3 minutes was enough. At the appointed hour, Vincent had lifted the cake onto the silver serving cart himself. Vincent had wheeled it out of the kitchen. Vincent had crossed the corridor between the kitchen and the grand hall. Vincent had personally set the cake down at the center of the long table, adjusted its position with his own hands, and stepped back. No other hand had touched that cake within the walls of this estate. Not the chef, not the pastry assistant, not the 3 waiters who had passed within meters of it during the evening. All had been questioned. All had confirmed the same account, independently, without knowing what the others had said. The report ended. The room was silent. Alessandro said nothing for a long time. His hands rested flat on the surface of the desk. His face did not change. The man in front of him did not move, did not shift his weight, did not so much as clear his throat. He knew the rhythm of these silences. He waited. Vincent. The name settled into Alessandro's chest like a stone dropped into deep water. Vincent, who had served the Moretti family for more than 30 years. Vincent, who had been at his father's funeral, standing 1 step behind the coffin, holding the umbrella against the rain. Vincent, who had placed a small pistol into a 12-year-old Alessandro's hand for the first time and gently corrected his grip. Vincent, who had held Ethan in his arms on the day the boy was brought home from the hospital, back when the boy weighed no more than a folded coat, back when Alessandro's wife had still been alive to smile at the sight. Vincent could not have done this. It was not a thought. It was something deeper than a thought. It was the certainty of a man who had known another man for the entire length of his own life. It was the certainty of the hand that had once fed him as a child, and the certainty of the voice that had once read to him in the evenings when his mother had been too tired. Vincent could not have done this, but the fact remained. Only 1 hand had touched that cake. Alessandro closed his eyes. The war began behind them. On one side, reason. The truth is the truth, and the truth does not care what a heart wants to believe. On the other side, 30 years, 3 decades of a man who had never once lied to him, not even about the smallest thing, not even to save himself from a moment of embarrassment. 3 decades of a loyalty that had been tested more times than Alessandro could count, and had never once broken. Neither side moved. He opened his eyes. He could not let this go. He could not allow a man who had placed a bomb into his son's birthday cake to walk freely through his hallways because his own heart did not want to believe it. That was the kind of weakness that got children killed in his world. He did not want to give the order, but he already knew he was going to. Alessandro rose slowly from behind the desk. The chair scraped softly against the wooden floor as he pushed it back. He did not look at the man still standing on the other side of the room. He crossed the study in 3 long, unhurried strides, and stopped at the tall window that looked out over the front of the estate. He placed one hand against the cold frame. For a long time, he did not move. Outside, the day had turned gray. A thin mist was moving across the lawn in slow drifts, curling around the base of the trees and blurring the edges of the drive. Far to the left, at the end of the property, a portion of the old grand hall was still visible, a jagged black outline against the sky. The collapsed roof caved inward like the ribcage of some enormous dead animal. Cleanup crews moved back and forth across the wreckage, small figures in dark jackets, sifting slowly through the ashes for whatever pieces of the truth had survived the fire. Alessandro looked at the ruin, but he did not really see it. What he saw, instead, was a memory from the evening before. He saw Vincent walking into the grand hall, wheeling the silver cart. The old man's hands had been steady on the handles, his back straight, his uniform pressed and immaculate as it had always been. He had smiled softly at Ethan as he passed the boy, the way a grandfather smiles at a grandchild. He had lifted the cake carefully with both hands and placed it at the center of the long table. He had adjusted its position by 1/2 inch, then adjusted it back. He had stepped away with the small satisfaction of a man who had done his job well. Those hands, those old, gentle, patient hands. Then, laid over that image, another one, sharper, fresher, from only a few hours ago. Ethan, on the grass, alive, breathing against his shoulder. Alessandro closed his eyes for one long moment. He drew in a breath through his nose, slowly, and let it out just as slowly. There was no way around it. He did not want to believe. But wanting had nothing to do with what needed to be done next. A boss was not a man who was allowed to choose comfort. A boss was a man who was required to walk toward the truth even when the truth was pointed like a knife at his own heart. He turned from the window. His voice, when he spoke, was low and dry. It was the voice of a man reading from a page he did not want to read. "Bring him to me." The lieutenant lifted his head. "Alive," Alessandro said. "You do not touch him. You do not raise your voice at him. You do not put a hand on him unless he raises a hand first, and he will not raise a hand. You will treat him with the same respect you would show your own father. You will tell him only that I have requested his presence, and you will bring him here. I want to hear it from his own mouth. If he is innocent, I will owe him more than an apology." The lieutenant lowered his head once. "Yes, boss." He turned and left the study. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. Alessandro returned to his chair. He sat down slowly. He folded his hands on the surface of the desk. The polished wood caught the pale light from the window and threw it back in a dim, flat gleam. He waited. He did not reach for the glass of liquor that still stood untouched at his elbow from the night before. He did not reach for the telephone. He did not reach for anything at all. He simply sat with his hands folded and let his thoughts fall wherever they wished to fall. He did not know what he wanted to hear when Vincent walked through that door. If Vincent denied it, Alessandro would have to look into the old man's eyes and decide whether he was being lied to for the first time in 30 years. That would break something in him he was not sure could be repaired. If Vincent admitted it, Alessandro would have to look into the old man's eyes and decide what a boss did to a man who had cared for him since childhood, and who had, somehow, in some way that made no sense, sold his son. Both answers would hurt. Both answers would take something from him that he would never get back. He let his mind drift, for a moment, into the past. Vincent had been the one who had carried him to bed at night when his mother was too busy running the household to sit with him. Vincent had taught him how to knot his first tie, standing behind him in front of the tall mirror in his father's dressing room, guiding the small hands through the motions. Vincent had stood one step behind him at his father's funeral, holding the umbrella over both of them, saying nothing, only there. Vincent had been in every important moment of his life, for as long as he had a life to remember. He did not want to believe that this man had sold his son. But if not Vincent, then who? He had no answer. He only had a chair, a desk, and a door that would open again very soon. He waited. The lieutenant did not return alone this time. He came through the door of the study with 2 other men close behind him, and Alessandro knew before any of them had spoken that something had gone wrong. It was in the way they walked. It was in the shortness of the lieutenant's breath. It was in the fact that Vincent was not with them. Alessandro rose from the desk. "Where is he?" The lieutenant did not raise his eyes. "Boss, we went to his quarters. The door was closed but not locked. We knocked. There was no answer. When we opened the door we found him. A pause. The kind of pause that carries weight. He was on the floor, unconscious. There was an empty bottle beside him." Alessandro's hand tightened once against the surface of the desk. Alive. Yes, boss. Barely. He was still breathing when we found him. We called the doctor immediately. He is being taken to the private wing at Street Anselm's now. The team is with him. We came ahead. Alessandro did not wait to hear the rest. He was already moving. Within 20 minutes he was inside a black car, and within an hour he was standing in the doorway of a small, quiet room in the private wing of the hospital the family had used for years. The staff there knew better than to write down names that had not been given to them. The staff there knew better than to ask questions. Vincent lay on a bed near the window. He looked smaller than Alessandro had ever remembered him. Smaller than the man who had lifted him as a child. Smaller than the man who had held the umbrella at his father's grave. His face was gray. His lips were tinged a color that no living face should be. A clear tube ran into the back of one hand, another into his nose. The soft, steady beep of a monitor at his side was the only sound in the room. The doctor stood at the foot of the bed with a folder pressed against his chest. He spoke in the low, even voice that men in his profession used with families they did not wish to make cry. He will live, boss. We reached him in time. What he took was meant to end him slowly, and slowly it would have. But he swallowed it not long before your men arrived. His stomach was pumped. His breathing has stabilized. His heart is holding. He will not wake for many hours, perhaps until tomorrow, but he will wake. Alessandro nodded once. He did not speak. The doctor understood, gave a small bow of the head, and stepped out of the room. Alessandro walked slowly to the side of the bed. He looked at the old man's face for a long time. A question began to form in his mind, and once it began to form, it would not stop growing. If Vincent were the man behind the bomb, if Vincent were the one who had planned the death of his son, then this made no sense. A man who plans such a thing and fails at it does not swallow poison the next morning. A man who plans such a thing runs. A man like that has a passport hidden in a drawer, a plane ticket bought under another name, a bag packed at the back of a closet. Men who arrange murders always arrange their escape at the same time. It is the first thing they arrange. It is the only rule of that trade that has never been broken. Vincent had no bag. Vincent had no passport in his pocket. Vincent had not run. Vincent had lain down on the floor of his own small room, in the house he had served for more than 30 years, and swallowed a bottle. That was not the act of a man who had planned a murder. That was the act of a man who had been broken by one, which meant Vincent was not the planner, which meant Vincent was a piece on someone else's board. But whose board? Alessandro had no answer. Not yet. Outside the window, the sun had climbed higher into a gray, cold sky. The morning light fell weakly across the linens of the bed and across the old, motionless hand that lay curled on top of the blanket. Alessandro reached out and rested his own hand very gently over that curled one. The skin beneath his palm was thin and cool, marked with the veins and small brown spots of a life that had been lived entirely in service to another family. He held it for a long moment. He did not know if Vincent could hear him. He did not know if any part of the old man's mind was still awake beneath the sedation and the medicines and the long night that was still to come. He spoke anyway. Not for Vincent. For himself. Tell me the truth when you wake up, old friend. I will listen. I promise. Then he turned and walked out of the room. In the hallway, he stopped, gathered the 2 guards who had followed him, and gave the order in a voice that left no room for interpretation. Nobody enters this room. Not a nurse we have not personally cleared. Not a doctor without an escort. Not a cleaner. Nobody. Double the men outside. 2 more inside the room, at all times. 1 at the door, 1 at the window. If a stranger so much as breathes near this floor, I want to know within 30 seconds. The guards nodded and moved. Alessandro looked once more at the closed door of the room where the oldest friend of his life was sleeping under a machine. Then he walked down the corridor, and out into the cold morning, and back toward a house where he now knew, with certainty, that the enemy was not the man in the bed. The enemy was still somewhere on the other side of his own walls. Night settled over the city, the private wing of Street. Anselm's hospital fell into the deep quiet that only hospitals learn how to hold, the low hum of machines behind closed doors, the soft footsteps of night nurses on rubber soles, the occasional cough of a patient somewhere far down a corridor. In the room at the end of the wing, Vincent lay motionless beneath a thin blanket, his chest rising and falling in the slow, mechanical rhythm of a man kept alive by tubes and vigilance. At the door of that room, 2 of Alessandro's guards stood watch, weapons hidden under their jackets. 2 more stood at the far end of the corridor, in the shadow beside the stairwell door. Another was posted inside the room itself, seated in a low chair against the wall, his eyes never leaving the sleeping figure on the bed. They were waiting for morning. What came instead was a movement. It began just past 11. The guard at the stairwell noticed them first. 2 men walking down the corridor in the white coats of hospital staff, their pace even, their heads slightly bowed, folders held under their arms. They looked like doctors. They walked like doctors. Their identification cards hung correctly from their collars. Everything about them was in order. Everything. Except for one thing. The guard had memorized every physician cleared to work in this wing tonight. The list was short. Every face on that list had been walked past him earlier in the evening, so that he could recognize each one on sight. These 2 faces were not on that list. He did not speak. He did not shout. He lifted one hand, closed his fingers into a fist, and the guard beside him understood at once. Both men reached inside their jackets. Both men stepped forward into the light of the corridor. The 2 strangers froze. For half a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one of the strangers reached beneath his white coat. The guard fired first. The corridor exploded into sound. A pane of glass at the end of the hallway shattered inward, showering the linoleum with bright fragments. An alarm somewhere in the building began to shriek, red lights strobing the walls in sudden pulses. The 2 attackers ducked, returned fire, retreated. They did not press forward. They knew, the moment the first shot cracked out, that they had lost the element they had come for. They turned and ran. The stairwell door slammed open behind them. Footsteps echoed downward, fast, then faded. By the time the guards from Vincent's store reached the stairwell, the 2 men were gone. A dark sedan was already pulling away from the service entrance at the rear of the building, its lights off, its tires making little more than a whisper against the wet pavement. Nobody in the corridor was seriously hurt. One guard had a graze along the side of his jaw that the doctor would clean in 10 minutes. Another had a small cut across the back of one hand from a piece of falling glass. That was all. Vincent, in his bed, had not stirred once. Alessandro received the call in his private study just before midnight. He listened to the report in silence. He asked 2 questions. He hung up the phone. He did not move for a long time afterward. He simply stood at the tall window, his hand resting flat against the cold glass, staring out at the dark grounds of the estate. Somewhere in the night, in a car he could not see, 2 men who had failed to kill Vincent were driving back to the person who had sent them. Somewhere in the city, that person was waiting to hear that a patient in a private room had died quietly in his sleep. That person had made a mistake tonight, because now, at last, Alessandro understood. If Vincent had been the true mind behind the bomb, then no one on earth would be sending men to silence him. A leader does not have anyone to be afraid of. A leader plans. A leader executes. A leader disappears or waits to be caught. A leader is never a threat to anyone else in the plan. If Vincent had been that leader, he would be lying alone in that hospital bed with only the machines watching him tonight. But he was not alone. Someone had come for him. Someone had sent men to close his mouth before it could open, which meant Vincent was not the leader. Vincent was a piece. Vincent had been moved by another hand, and that other hand did not want Vincent to speak, which meant everything Alessandro had believed since the moment the report crossed his desk that afternoon was wrong. The name at the top of his suspicions had been the wrong name all along. The real name, the true architect of the bomb inside his son's birthday cake, was still somewhere in his own house, walking through his own hallways, eating at his own table, smiling at him when he passed in the corridor. He did not know that name yet, but he knew that when Vincent woke, he would have it. He returned to the desk. He lifted the telephone once more. His voice, when he spoke to the hospital, was quiet and absolutely level. Double the men outside his room. Double the men in the corridor. 2 on the stairwell. 2 at the service entrance. Nobody enters that room tonight except me and the head physician. Nobody. Not a nurse we have not walked through in person. Not a cleaner. Not a priest. If a man asks to bring water to that room, you shoot him where he stands and apologize to me later. He hung up. He did not go to bed. He did not lie down. He did not so much as loosen his tie. He sat in the chair behind his desk, hands folded, and he waited for the sun. That night, in the great empty house of the Moretti family, the most powerful man in New York did not sleep. Dawn came slowly over the city. The sky beyond the tall windows of the private wing was still gray, still cold, but it had begun to lift at the edges the pale, colorless light that always comes before the true morning. The corridor outside Vincent's room was quiet again. The broken glass had been swept away in the small hours of the night. The alarm had long since fallen silent. Only the doubled ring of guards remained, standing along the walls in stillness, watching every door, every stairwell, every corner where a shadow might pass. Just before the sun cleared the rooftops of the eastern buildings, A nurse walked quickly out of Vincent's room and spoke a single word to the guard at the door. The guard reached for his phone. The message went to Alessandro at 17 minutes past 6. He was already dressed. He was already waiting. By 7, his car was at the service entrance of the hospital. By 7 to 10, he was walking down the long private corridor. His footsteps were slow, deliberate. The guards straightened as he passed. He did not look at them. His eyes were fixed on the door at the end of the hall. He entered the room. Vincent was awake. He was propped weakly against a pillow, his skin still gray, his eyes hollow, one thin arm still connected to the drip beside the bed. The old man's head turned slowly toward the sound of the door. When his gaze found Alessandro's face, something inside him seemed to break at once. He tried to push himself up a small, weak motion of a body that could no longer obey him. He failed. His arms trembled beneath him and gave out. Then the tears came, not the tears of a man ashamed to be caught, not the tears of a man begging for his life. Something older and deeper and more terrible. Vincent wept the way a father weeps at the graveside of a child. "Kill me, boss." His voice was a torn whisper. "I beg you, kill me. I do not deserve to breathe the same air as you. Please, give me that mercy. Kill me." Alessandro did not answer. He crossed the small room in 3 slow steps. He reached the side of the bed. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He did not condemn. He drew the small chair beside the bed a little closer, sat down on it, folded his hands loosely between his knees, and looked at the broken face in front of him. His voice, when he spoke, was so quiet that the nurse listening at the door would not have heard it over the sound of her own breath. "Tell me, everything." Vincent shattered. The words came out of him in pieces at first, then in a flood, between long, wet, hitching breaths, between broken pauses, when his throat closed on him and his shoulders shook. The truth came. His family, his wife, his son, his grandchildren, all of them. They had been taken. Days before the party, they had disappeared from the small house where they had lived for many years. He had known within hours. A photograph had been sent to his phone. Then a voice on the line. A voice he knew. A voice that told him, in the flat tone of a man reading from a shopping list, that his family would live only if he agreed to place a small object into the birthday cake of Alessandro's only son. He had refused. He had wept. He had bargained. He had begged. The voice had told him that refusal would be answered with a delivery to his door, a delivery he did not want to open. He had understood. He had believed. He swore he had believed that the small object was only a device for listening, a way to gather what was said inside the grand hall of the Moretti estate. He had told himself this again and again. He had told himself this even as his hands had done what his hands had done. He had told himself this right up to the moment when he had watched the small figure of Ethan step toward the cake with a lit candle in each of his eyes, the same little boy Vincent had once cradled in his own arms in the hospital, where he had been born. He had watched Alessandro lift the silver knife, and in that moment, standing at the back of the hall in his pressed uniform, Vincent had done something he had never done in the whole of his long life. He had prayed. He had prayed for a miracle. The miracle had come. It had come in the shape of a 3-year-old child. And when Vincent had returned to his small room in the servants' wing, when the guests had gone and the sirens had faded, when he understood at last what he had almost done, he had also understood one other thing. He could not carry that weight into another morning. That was why he had done what he had done. Not to hide the truth, not to escape justice. Simply because he could not bear to open his eyes to another sunrise and know what he had almost placed into the hands of the child he had once rocked to sleep. He wept as he told it. He did not lift his head. His hands, thin and old, gripped the blanket in front of him, as if the blanket were the only thing holding him to the earth. And then, at the end of it, the last piece. The name. Vincent said the name. Marco. Alessandro did not move. Marco. The man he had called brother. The man who stood at his right hand at every meeting. The man who walked with him through every hallway of this life. The man who, only the night before, had stepped forward in the dust and smoke of the ruined grand hall and had promised, with a face full of grief, to hunt down whoever had done this. Marco, the one who had done it. Alessandro sat very still. Somewhere far behind his ribs, something ancient and quiet went cold. The world did not spin. The world did not roar. The world simply slowed, the way a heavy stone slows as it sinks into deep water, and settled. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He reached out the same hand that had once held a silver knife above a cake, the same hand that had held his son against his chest on a lawn full of smoke and rested it, gently, on the old man's shoulder. "Live," he said. His voice was soft. It was steady. It carried no forgiveness in it, and no punishment either. It carried only a promise. Live long enough to see this end. Alessandro left the hospital while the sky was still the color of iron. The car moved through the empty streets at speed, but he sat in the back seat without watching the road. His hands rested loosely on his knees. His eyes were open. His mind was somewhere else entirely, running its own careful, unhurried work. By the time the tall gates of the estate opened for him, he had already decided what would happen next. He crossed the front hall, climbed the wide staircase, and walked into his study without slowing. Behind him, one of his lieutenants had been called ahead by phone and was already waiting at the door. Alessandro did not sit. He did not remove his coat. He turned only when the door had been closed, and when he spoke, his voice was flat and dry, the way a stone is flat and dry. "Bring Marco to me." The lieutenant's head came up. He did not ask. He did not blink. Now, not later, not this afternoon. Now, take as many men as you need. Do not send word ahead. Do not knock. If you find him in his bed, drag him out of it. If you find him in the shower, drag him out wet. I want him standing in this room within the hour, alive, whole, able to speak. Yes, boss. And another thing. The lieutenant paused at the door. Alessandro's eyes were very steady. You do not tell him why. You do not answer any question he asks you. If he asks, you say only that the boss wishes to see him. Whatever expression he makes when he hears it, you remember it. You bring me his face along with the man. Yes, boss. The door closed. Alessandro stood alone in the study for a long moment, and then, slowly, he lowered himself into the chair behind the desk. He did not reach for the telephone. He did not reach for a drink. He simply sat with his hands folded in front of him and let the memories come. Marco, standing at his right shoulder in every meeting for the last 10 years. Marco, laughing at his own jokes across long dinners in the private room at the back of the restaurant on Mulberry Street. Marco, the first man through the door on the night of the raid at the docks, taking 2 bullets in the vest so that Alessandro would not take one in the chest. Marco, whose loyalty had been sworn to him more times than Alessandro could count, in words, in blood, in the small, silent glance across a crowded room that said, "I am with you." Marco, the same man who had taken an old servant's wife and children out of their small home in the middle of the night. The same man who had held a photograph of a bound woman up to a phone and read out a sentence like a grocery list. The same man who had stood beside Alessandro in the smoke of the ruined Grand Hall and had promised, with grief on his face, to find whoever had done this. Alessandro was not angry the way an ordinary man becomes angry. He did not slam his hand on the desk. He did not curse. He did not pace the length of the room and knock a lamp from its stand. His anger was of a different kind. It was the cold, slow, absolute anger of a man who has finally recognized the face of the thing he has been feeding at his own table for years. It moved through him quietly, and it did not stop moving. It simply became part of him, part of his breathing, part of the way his hands rested on the wood in front of him. He waited. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The pale sun rose a little higher outside the tall windows. A bird called somewhere in the garden. Inside the study, the clock on the mantelpiece marked each second with the same soft, indifferent tick it had marked for years. He did not check the clock. He did not need to. He knew how long it should take. He knew every meter of ground between his study and Marco's quarters at the far end of the west wing. He knew the doors his men would open. He knew the footsteps they would take. Eventually, the door of the study opened again. Only one man came through, the lieutenant. No one behind him. Alessandro looked up slowly. The lieutenant did not speak at once. He walked to the center of the room, stopped, and placed his hands behind his back the way a soldier stands when he must deliver news he does not want to deliver. "Boss, speak. He is not there." Alessandro did not move. "Explain." The door of his quarters was unlocked. The bed had not been slept in. His closet was full, nothing seemed taken, no bag missing that we could see. His car is still in the garage. There is no note. There is no sign of a struggle, no sign of a hurried departure, no sign of anything, boss. It is as if he simply walked out of the room and did not come back. Silence. Alessandro sat still for a very long time. Marco had moved first. Somewhere between the failed attack in the hospital corridor last night and the first hour of this morning, someone had reached him. Perhaps the 2 men who had fled through the stairwell. Perhaps a third pair of eyes Alessandro had not yet accounted for. It did not matter which. What mattered was that Marco had heard. Marco had understood. Marco had known. with the sharp instinct of a man who had once helped Alessandro corner other men in exactly this way, that the walls were beginning to close around him. And Marco had gone. He had not run in the ordinary way. He had not taken his car. He had not packed his things. That was not carelessness. That was calculation. He had left everything in place so that the disappearance would take longer to notice, so that the search would be delayed by even a few hours. Every hour he could steal was an hour he could use to prepare. Alessandro slowly folded his hands one more time on the surface of the desk. He did not yet have Marco, but he knew one thing about the man he had once called brother. Marco would not have gone far without carrying something with him, something to trade, something to hold, something to place on the table when the hunter finally caught up to him. Marco would not run empty-handed. Alessandro drew in a long, slow breath. At that precise moment, there came a sharp, urgent knock at the study door. The door of the study swung open before the knocking had finished. A young lieutenant stumbled through it, one of the newer men, one Alessandro had never before seen with such a face on him. His skin was drained to the color of paper. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. His hand shook against the doorframe as he tried to steady himself. "Boss." Alessandro was already rising. "Speak. It is the boy, boss. Ethan. He is not in his room." For half a second, the world in the study did not move. "Say that again." "Ethan is not in his room. The bed is empty. I went in myself. I checked the bathroom. I checked the closet. I checked the balcony. He is not there. And boss, the housekeeper, Sophia, and the little girl, they are also gone, all three of them, from different rooms, all three." There was a sound in Alessandro's ears that was not a sound. It was the disappearance of every other sound. The clock on the mantelpiece was still ticking. The young man's breath was still catching in his throat. The wind outside was still moving through the trees at the edge of the lawn, and Alessandro heard none of it. He heard only the slow, steady rush of his own blood. Then his body moved. He crossed the study in 5 long strides. He was past the lieutenant before the man could step aside. He did not run down the corridor at first. He walked, quickly, deliberately, the way a man walks when he is refusing to allow himself to believe what he has just been told. By the time he reached the staircase, he was running. He climbed 2 steps at a time. His hand caught the banister at the top and swung him around it. The door to Ethan's guest room stood ajar. He pushed it open. The bed was empty. The small, folded blanket had been pulled halfway back. The pillow still held the faint hollow of a small head. Alessandro placed his palm on the sheet. Warm. Not warm from the sun. Warm the way a bed is warm when someone has left it in the last hour. His hand closed slowly on the fabric. He straightened. He turned. He walked out of the room, down the corridor, around the corner, past the tall window that overlooked the garden, and stopped at the door of the sitting room that had been given to Sophia and Lily. The door was open. The room was empty. The little bag Sophia had carried in with her the night before, holding a change of clothes for herself and a folded dress for Lily, was still on the small chair beside the wardrobe, untouched. The bed had not been slept in on that side. The small blanket Lily had been given was folded neatly at the foot of the mattress. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been disturbed. Only the people were missing. Alessandro moved through the rest of the estate as if the estate were a house he had never seen before. He opened doors. He crossed rooms. He walked into the kitchen and found the morning staff frozen at their posts, staring at him. He walked into the sunroom. He walked into the library. He walked into every room on the 2nd floor where a child might have wandered on a strange morning. Nothing. He called their names. He called Ethan's name in the corridor. He called Sophia's name at the top of the staircase. He called for Lily at the door of the small sitting room where she had watched a bird from the window the day before. Nothing answered him. He stopped at last in the middle of the long hallway on the 2nd floor. He was breathing hard. His hand was trembling at his side. It was the first time in 15 years that any man in this house would have seen the boss's hand tremble. But there was no one in the corridor to see it now. For the first time in this entire long, terrible day, Alessandro Moretti allowed a feeling that was not anger and not calculation to move through him. Fear. Not the loud kind, not the shouting kind, the other kind. The one that arrives in a great, absolute stillness. The way water arrives in a room when the walls have finally broken. Marco had gone. But Marco had not gone empty-handed. Marco had taken his son. Marco had taken the woman who had held Ethan against her chest on the lawn last night. Marco had taken the 3-year-old whose small voice had saved all their lives. Alessandro stood alone in the hallway of his own house, the house he had rebuilt after his father, the house he had guarded with an entire army of men, and understood, in the absolute silence of that moment, that the walls had not protected him at all. The walls had only kept the enemy closer. He walked slowly back to the study. He closed the door behind him. He crossed to his chair. He sat down. His hands folded themselves on the desk in front of him, as they had 100 times in the last day. He did not weep. He did not shout. He did not smash anything. He simply sat and looked at the door and waited. He knew Marco would not kill them yet. Marco needed them alive. Marco needed a piece to place on the table when he sat down across from Alessandro for the last time. A dead child could not be traded. A dead housekeeper could not be traded. A dead 3-year-old could not be traded. Marco needed them breathing, but Alessandro did not know when the call would come. Not in an hour, not in a day, perhaps not before the sun went down, perhaps not before another sun rose. He did not know. He could only wait. And waiting, he understood suddenly, was the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do in his entire life, because every second of it was a second in which his son and the small girl who had cried out at a birthday cake were somewhere in this city, somewhere on this earth, and he did not know where. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. On the desk in front of him, his phone began to buzz. The screen lit up. There was no name, there was no number, only 2 words that told him everything. Unknown caller. A few minutes later, the phone on the desk stopped buzzing. In its place, a small notification lit the dark screen. A message had arrived from the unknown number. A single video file. Nothing else. Alessandro placed his thumb on the screen and opened it. The image was dim, grainy. Taken from a low angle, the way footage is taken when the person holding the camera does not care about clarity, only about proof. An empty concrete floor. Rusted metal columns rising into the shadows above. A single yellow bulb somewhere out of frame, casting a weak circle of light across a small group of figures huddled together against the far wall. His son was there. Ethan sat against the concrete, his wrists bound in front of him, still in the shirt he had gone to sleep in the night before. His hair was tangled. There was a smear of dust across one cheek, but his eyes were open, and his eyes were dry. Alessandro's son did not cry. The boy sat very still, the way a boy sits when he has decided that he will not give the men around him the satisfaction of watching him break. Beside Ethan sat Lily. Her small hands were bound too, in a loose loop of cord that had clearly been tied by someone who did not want to hurt her. She was not looking at the camera. She was holding on, with both bound hands together, to the wrist of the elderly woman seated next to her, an old woman with silver-gray hair and a face carved by many years, Vincent's wife. Beyond her sat 2 others, younger, folded against each other in silence, Vincent's son, and a small figure that must have been one of the grandchildren. All bound, all silent, all alive. At the very edge of the frame, half in shadow, was Sophia. A cloth had been tied across her mouth. Her hair had come loose. Her hands were bound behind her back, but her eyes had not left Lily for even a second. She was leaning against her daughter as much as her bonds would allow, her shoulder pressed gently against the little girl's shoulder, offering the only comfort a mother could still offer under a strip of cloth. Alessandro watched the video to the end. It was short, perhaps 12 seconds. When it ended, the screen went dark, and then, a moment later, a second message appeared beneath it. A single line of text, an address, and 2 sentences. Come alone. If we see even one of your men within a mile of this place, we begin killing them one at a time, and you will hear each one over the phone. Starting with the little girl. Alessandro read the address twice. He set the phone face down on the desk. He knew this trap. He had helped design others exactly like it, years ago, when men on the other side of the city had needed to be pulled out of their fortresses so that their heads could be separated from their armies. It was a good trap. It was the kind of trap he had used himself. Marco had learned from him. Marco wanted him to arrive alone. Marco wanted him to walk into that warehouse without a single gun at his back. Marco wanted to end this the only way it could truly be ended, with the 2 of them face to face, and only one of them walking out. If he did not go, they would all die. His son, the 3-year-old who had cried out over a birthday cake, the woman who had shielded her daughter with her own body on a smoking lawn, the old wife of the man in the hospital bed, the children of that old man, all of them, every one of them. He rose from the chair. He walked to the door of the study and opened it. 3 of his most trusted lieutenants were already waiting in the corridor. They had been listening for the sound of his voice from the moment the phone had gone dark. When he stepped out, they turned to him as one. There is a location, he said. Marco has sent it. I am going. The oldest of them stepped forward at once. Boss, no. Not alone. That is exactly what he wants. I know. You cannot walk in there by yourself. You will not walk out. I know. Boss, please, let me take 2 vans. We stay a block out. We come in behind you. He will never see us until it is done, he said. If a single one of my men is seen within a mile, he begins killing them. Starting with the little girl. The lieutenant fell silent. You will not come within a mile, Alessandro said. His voice remained low and calm, but there was iron in it now, the kind that could not be argued with. You will hold at a distance. You will stay off the main road. You will listen. When there is a signal, you will move. Not before, not 1 meter closer, not 1 second sooner. If you disobey me on this, that little girl dies before I can lift my hand. Do you understand? They understood. He did not tell them what else he was thinking. He did not tell them of the one small hope he was carrying with him, the thing he had arranged before he left the hospital that morning, the thing no one in this room knew about. He kept that piece hidden, the way a man keeps the last card of a hand pressed against his chest. It was too small a hope to speak aloud, and too important to share. He walked past them to the front door of the estate. He did not take a coat. He took only his keys. The car was waiting in the drive. He opened the door himself. He sat down behind the wheel. He started the engine. He drove out through the tall gates of the Moretti estate alone, in the pale, cold light of the afternoon, and turned south, toward the warehouse district at the far edge of the city. The sun had gone down by the time Alessandro reached the warehouse. He turned off the main road and let the car roll to a stop at the edge of the old industrial district. The buildings on either side of him stood abandoned, long, low blocks of gray metal and rusted stone, their windows boarded up, their signs peeling. A cold wind moved between them, carrying the faint, damp smell of the harbor. He stepped out of the car. He closed the door. He did not lock it. The warehouse rose in front of him, a hulking shadow against a sky the color of ink. A single bulb burned above a small side entrance. The door beneath it was ajar. He walked toward it. He walked as a man walks who has already decided that the ground he is walking on may be the last ground he will ever cross. His pace did not quicken. His breath did not shorten. His hands did not touch the small weapon at his side. He simply walked, one measured step at a time, until he stood at the threshold of the open door. He pushed the door with his fingertips. He stepped inside. The air was colder here, damp. It smelled of old rust and of the salt of the water not far away. Somewhere high above him, a broken pipe was dripping in a slow, uneven rhythm. The yellow light of a few surviving bulbs on the far ceiling threw everything below into a dim, unsteady glow. In front of him, spread across the concrete floor, more than a dozen armed men stood in a loose, curving line. At the center of that line stood Marco. He was in a dark coat. His hands were in his pockets. His face, the face Alessandro had seen every day for years, the face that had smiled across countless dinner tables, the face that had bowed a fraction of an inch each morning in the corridor of the estate, was no longer the face of a right hand. The mask was gone. What stood there now was the man beneath the mask, and Alessandro had never in his life seen him before. Behind Marco, against the back wall of the warehouse, sat the hostages. Ethan first, bound to a wooden chair, his wrists tied in front of him, his mouth sealed with a strip of gray tape. When the boy saw his father, his eyes went wide. He did not thrash. He did not try to cry out. He only looked. And in that look was every question an 8-year-old could ask without moving his lips. Beside him, Sophia, tied the same way. Her cheeks were wet and streaked. When her eyes found Alessandro's, tears began again immediately, silent, without sound. Beside her, Lily, small feet not touching the floor, bound gently, with a cord that had clearly been tied by someone who did not want to leave marks on the skin of a child. Her tiny hands were folded in her lap, her eyes lifted to meet Alessandro's, and unlike everyone else in that terrible room, her gaze was steady. She was not crying. She was not shaking. She looked at him the way a child looks at a person she believes will fix what has gone wrong, as if her being here were nothing more than a mistake that this man in front of her would soon correct. Beside her, Vincent's family, his wife, upright and pale, his son, the small grandchildren, huddled against each other in silence, all alive, all watching. Alessandro turned back to Marco. He slowly reached inside his coat, drew the small pistol he had brought with him, and let it drop from his fingers. It struck the concrete with a flat metallic sound and slid a foot across the floor. 2 of Marco's men stepped forward. They frisked him quickly, patting down his sides, his ankles, his back. They took nothing more, because there was nothing more to take. When they stepped away, they gave Marco a small nod. Alessandro walked forward until he stood 10 paces from the man he had once called his brother. He looked into Marco's face for a long moment. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet, steady, without heat. "Why did you betray me? I always treated you like a brother." Marco's mouth curved into a smile that had no warmth in it. It was the smile of a man who has been waiting many, many years to smile. That particular smile, a smile grown slowly, in the dark, feeding on years of small resentments that Alessandro had never known were there. When Marco spoke, the words came out of him without hurry, almost as if he were relieved to say them at last. "Because for 3 generations, my family has bled for yours." He took a small step forward. "My grandfather worked for your grandfather. My father worked for your father. My father took a bullet to save your father. Do you know what he was given for that? A quiet funeral, a folded flag, a pension for my mother that ran out before I finished school. In this city, everyone knows the Moretti name. Everyone. Nobody remembers his." His voice began to rise. "You were born standing on his grave. You inherited a throne you never bled for. You wear a name that would not exist without a Ricci in the ground. And I have spent my whole life standing behind you, opening doors for you, taking bullets for you, calling you brother while the men in this city say your name and never mine." He raised his hand. The pistol came out of his coat pocket. "I do not want to live in your shadow one more day." He leveled the barrel at Alessandro's chest. His finger tightened on the trigger. At that precise moment, the same instant Marco's finger closed on the trigger, another shot rang out. It did not come from Marco's gun. It came from somewhere behind him, from the far end of the warehouse, cracking across the wide, dim space like a whip. The bullet found Marco's arm at the joint just above the elbow. His whole body jerked. The pistol in his hand fired wide as his fingers spasmed open, the round burying itself somewhere in the concrete far to Alessandro's right. Marco cried out. The pistol clattered from his grip and struck the floor. Around him, his men snapped their heads in the direction of the shot, but by then, it was already too late. From behind a row of tall metal shelving at the back of the warehouse, figures moved forward into the yellow light. 6, 8, more still stepping from the shadows on either side. Men in dark coats, weapons already raised, already trained on the ring of gunmen who had thought this room belonged to them. And at the front of that group, walking with the slow, careful step of a man whose body was not yet strong enough for what he was asking it to do, came Vincent. His skin was still gray, his shirt hung loose on him, one thin hand pressed against his side where the strain of standing had already begun to tell on him. But his other hand held a pistol, and the pistol was steady, and his eyes were clear. He had left the hospital bed. He had gathered the men he had known for decades, old servants of the family, quiet lieutenants who had answered to Vincent's word for years before they had answered to Marco's, and he had brought them here because he had known, with the certainty of a man who had watched Alessandro grow up, that Alessandro would come alone. The warehouse exploded into sound. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness in short bursts of white fire. Bullets struck metal and concrete and rusted beams. Marco's men scattered for cover, firing back over their shoulders. The old warehouse became a cavern of shouting and gunfire, and the ringing of ricochets. Alessandro was already moving. He did not run toward Marco. He did not run toward the shooters. He ran toward the back wall, toward the small, bound figures in the wooden chairs. He reached Ethan first. He dropped to one knee, drew the folding knife from the inner lining of his coat, the small knife he had carried since he was 20 years old, the small knife no Frisk had ever found, and cut through the cords at his son's wrists in 3 quick motions. He pulled the strip of tape from Ethan's mouth as gently as he could, and pressed the boy briefly, fiercely, against his own chest. "Down," he said. "On the floor, under the chair. Do not move." Ethan nodded. He slid to the concrete without a word. Alessandro turned. He cut Sophia loose next. Her hands flew to Lily even before her own bindings had fallen away. He cut the little girl free. He cut Vincent's wife free. He cut Vincent's son. He cut the children. In under a minute, the row of bound figures at the back of the warehouse had become a small huddle of freed bodies, crouched low behind the wooden chairs, pressed against the cold wall. Alessandro turned to run back into the fight, and in that moment, a single gunman who had crawled around behind the stack of shelves lifted his rifle. He had a clean line at the center of Alessandro's back. Vincent saw it. He was already 30 feet away, already staggering, already bleeding lightly from where the strain of the fight had reopened something inside him. But he did not think. He did not calculate. He did not measure how many steps he had left in him, or what it would cost, or whether he would be enough. He simply ran forward. He threw himself into the space between the gunman and Alessandro. The rifle fired, then it fired again, then it fired a third time. Vincent's body absorbed all 3. He stumbled once, took a single more step forward as if by pure will, and then his legs gave beneath him. Alessandro caught him. He caught him with both arms, the way a man catches a falling child. He went down onto one knee under the weight of him, and he lowered the old man slowly, onto the concrete floor of the warehouse. The white shirt Vincent had put on that morning, back in his hospital room, before slipping out through a service door and gathering old friends to a place no one had told him to come. That white shirt was no longer white. Vincent's eyes searched Alessandro's face and found it. He tried to speak. His voice came out very small and very rough. Only a few words. A last request. The names of the people at the back of the warehouse, his wife, his son, the children, and one word after them, spoken as softly as a prayer. Please. Alessandro nodded. He could not answer with words. He nodded again, harder, and this time a single tear broke loose and fell from his face and landed on the old man's cheek. Around them, the gunfire raged on. Alessandro laid Vincent down onto the concrete with the same slow care he had used to lift him a moment before. He motioned to one of his men, an older lieutenant who had already dropped his rifle and come running, and the man knelt at once and pressed both hands hard against Vincent's chest to hold the blood inside him. Alessandro placed his own hand briefly on the lieutenant's shoulder. A message passed between them without words. Keep him breathing, whatever it takes. Then Alessandro rose. The gun that had fallen from Marco's fingers still lay on the concrete floor 12 feet away. Alessandro did not look at it. He drew from the inside of his coat the second weapon he had brought with him, the one no one, not even his own men, had known about, and he stepped forward into the noise. The warehouse had become a storm. Muzzle flashes carved bright, jagged holes in the yellow-lit air. Bullets struck the metal shelving with dull, ringing snaps. Somewhere overhead, a stray round shattered one of the last surviving bulbs, and a curtain of shadow dropped across half the room. Alessandro's loyal men had already moved forward, using the shelving and the pillars for cover, closing in on Marco's ring of gunmen from 3 sides at once. Alessandro joined them from the 4th. He did not shout. He did not curse. He worked the way a man works when the work is a job that must be finished before the sun rises. One shot at a time. One target at a time. He moved with the calm of a boss who had come to the end of a very long day and only wanted to close a door. Marco's men began to fall. They had come here believing they were the trap and Alessandro was the prey. They had believed the count of guns in this room ran only one way. Now, one after another, they discovered the shape of their mistake as figures they did not know rose from the darkness behind them, as their line of cover collapsed inward, as the man they had trapped in the center of the room proved to be neither trapped nor alone. One went down beside the metal shelving. Another dropped by the loading door. A third turned to run and was cut down before he had crossed 3 meters of concrete. Through the smoke and the flashes, Marco was crawling. His right arm was useless, the joint at the elbow soaked and dark. He was dragging himself toward the corner where one of his men had dropped a rifle. His teeth were bared. His whole face had become the face of a cornered animal, no longer smiling, no longer speaking of grandfathers and shadows and thrones. He reached for the rifle with his left hand. His fingers scraped the barrel. Alessandro's boot came down on the weapon before Marco could close his grip. For one long heartbeat, the two of them were face to face on the floor of that warehouse, the boss of the Moretti family and the man who had called him brother for years. There was nothing left to say. Marco looked up at him. His mouth opened. Whatever he had prepared to say, a curse, a bargain, a final defiance, it never came out. His eyes were still burning with the same old resentment he had carried into this room, and they burned there until the end. Alessandro raised the pistol. The last shot in the warehouse was his. Then, quite suddenly, the gunfire stopped. The great echoing space fell into silence, broken only by the distant drip of the broken pipe overhead and by the ragged breathing of his own men. The revolt was over. The whole of Marco's force had been put down where they stood. Not one of them was left standing. Ethan, Lily, Sophia, and Vincent's family were safe. Alessandro turned at once and walked back to Vincent. The old man was still breathing. Barely. The lieutenant who had knelt beside him looked up, his hands red to the wrists, and reported quickly. 3 rounds. One had passed clean through a lung, but the pulse was still there, still steady, and if they moved fast enough there was a chance. A real chance. Alessandro dropped to one knee and took Vincent's hand. The old man's eyes opened just enough to find him. "You saved my life, old friend," Alessandro said. His voice was low and unsteady, but it held. "Now let us save yours." Vincent gave a small, weak nod. The medics his men had held in a van a mile away were already coming through the wide side door with a stretcher. They lifted Vincent as gently as if he were made of glass. They carried him out. Alessandro turned. At the back of the warehouse, The freed hostages were rising slowly from where they had been huddled against the wall. Ethan reached him first. The boy did not walk. He ran. He crashed into his father's chest with a force Alessandro had not felt from his son in years. And the boy, who had not shed a tear in front of any stranger tonight, finally broke. He sobbed openly into his father's coat. Alessandro wrapped both arms around him and held him without saying anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. A few steps away, Sophia had pulled Lily into her arms and was rocking her gently, her whole body shaking with tears she had been holding since the video, tears she could no longer keep silent. Vincent's wife was kneeling on the concrete where her husband had lain, one hand pressed against the small, dark stain his body had left behind, her mouth shaping his name over and over without sound. His son held the two grandchildren against him, and none of them spoke. Alessandro walked over. He knelt beside the old woman and placed one hand very gently on her shoulder. "He is alive," he said quietly. "He is going to the hospital now. He is strong. I promise you I will take care of everything. All of you. From this night forward, everything." She nodded through her tears. Behind them, the lieutenants had begun to move through the warehouse in silence, gathering the fallen, sorting weapons, walking the perimeter. It would all be handled the way such things were always handled by the Moretti family, carefully, quietly, and by dawn. Alessandro straightened. He picked Ethan up in his arms as if the boy were still small. The boy did not protest. He tucked his head into his father's neck. Sophia lifted Lily. Together they walked out through the side door of the warehouse into the cold night. The car was still waiting where he had left it. He set Ethan down in the passenger seat. Sophia climbed into the back with Lily curled against her. He closed the doors. On the drive back toward the estate, through streets that were slowly beginning to breathe again, Ethan leaned his head against his father's shoulder the way he had not done in many years, and did not lift it again the entire way home. Vincent had arrived at the hospital in critical condition. 3 rounds had torn through him, one straight through a lung, and for the first several hours the doctors had not been willing to promise anything to the family gathered outside the operating room. But the old man had held on. He had held on through the surgery, and through the long night that followed it, and through the days of quiet recovery that came after. Slowly, breath by breath, the color returned to his face. Slowly, he was strong enough to sit upright in bed. Slowly, he was strong enough to walk a few steps in the corridor with a hand along the wall. And in time, he was strong enough to come home. Alessandro never once blamed him. From the very first evening at the bedside, he understood what Vincent had truly been: not a traitor, but a grandfather who had been given an impossible choice between the family he loved and the family he served. That was not a sin a man could be punished for. That was only a wound, and wounds, Alessandro had come to believe, were things one healed together. After everything had settled, he took personal responsibility for Vincent's family. His wife, his son, and the grandchildren were brought into the estate itself. They were given their own rooms in the residential wing. They were treated in every way as members of the household. Vincent was offered the chance to remain not as a servant, not as an old employee working out the final years of a long career, but as a member of the Moretti family in the fullest sense of the word. The grand hall was rebuilt. New stone, new wood, new windows. The scars in the walls were smoothed away. Slowly, the estate began to look like a home again. And in the garden behind that home, Ethan and Lily were holding hands. They were laughing, the boy of 8 and the little girl of 3, running side by side across the grass in the late afternoon light, ducking under the low branches of the trees, chasing each other around the small stone bench near the fountain. Ethan slowed at every turn to let her keep up. Lily laughed with the kind of open, ringing laugh that only children can produce, the sound rising into the warm air of the garden and lifting itself gently into the sky. Sophia stood a few paces away, watching them. Her hands were folded in front of her. On her face at last, softly, quietly, there was a smile. Not the tight smile of a woman trying to be brave. Not the tired smile of a woman who has been holding herself together too long. A real smile, small and warm, that belonged to no one but her. On the veranda, Alessandro stood alone at the railing, watching. He watched his son laugh. He watched the small girl whose voice had once stopped an entire room laugh with him. He watched the young mother whose eyes had once met his through smoke on a lawn now stand in the sunlight with the calm of a woman finally allowed to rest. Farther down the garden, half in the shade of a tall tree, Vincent sat in a wooden chair beside his wife. His hair had gone whiter still after everything. His hand rested in hers. He was watching the children too, and his old eyes were wet not with grief this time, but with a kind of gratitude too large for a face that old to hold all at once. Alessandro looked at all of them. He thought about the empire he had built. He thought about the men who had feared his name for years, and the men who still feared it. He thought about all the doors that opened in this city because of who he was, and all the doors that closed for the same reason. He thought about power, what it could take, what it could command, what it could never earn, and he understood, at last, something he had not understood before that terrible night. Power can make people obey. Money can buy silence. But loyalty, the kind that steps in front of a bullet without a second's pause, cannot be bought, cannot be inherited, cannot be commanded. It can only be earned, slowly and in the small moments of ordinary life, through trust and sacrifice and love. And a family, a true family, is not always the one you are born into. Sometimes it is the one that walks with you through the smoke and stays beside you when everything else has burned to the ground. The house that had once held only a single lonely man and his son was full now, full of footsteps and voices and the small, ordinary sounds of ordinary days. 3 generations, finding a way to begin again together. Dear friends, thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it touched something in your heart tonight, please take a moment to leave a like on this video. Share it with someone who might need it, and if you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. Every like, every share, and every new subscriber helps this channel bring you more stories like this one, every single day. We would love to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Did any part of it remind you of something in your own life, a person you trusted, a family you built without expecting to, a small voice in your own past that changed the way you saw the world? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We read them, and we treasure every honest word you send us from the bottom of your heart, wishing you and everyone you love good health, peaceful days, and a life full of the kind of loyalty that steps forward when it matters most. Take care of yourselves, and we will see you again in the next story.